Welcome and aloha, everyone. Glad you could join us. Apologies for that little technical glitch. Not quite sure what that was. A negative greeting, as they say in the Ra material. So, welcome, aloha, benvenuti, g'day, mates. Very glad you could join us wherever you are around the world. We are here to talk about a topic that really is intriguing to me. I mean, this is a topic that kind of goes to the roots of my own kind of like journey into this vast field of exopolitics, and even before that. Now, before I begin, just kind of giving you a little bit of background, the webinar, for those that may be going to experience any kind of glitches, whether it's buffering or so forth, there is going to be a recording of this, and so you'll be able to watch the recording live if there is buffering and you miss anything. So we have a really intriguing webinar. Now, my own interest in this really began in the 1980s. I, at that time, was kind of trying to work my way in terms of finding out, what the big question, what am I supposed to do? So 1980, 83 was the crux moment for me. And I got interested in this issue of ascended masters. I got very interested in Indian philosophy and did a deep dive into that for well over a decade. Did meditation and those sorts of things. And, I must say my meditations were pretty mediocre. I never really got that far. Never achieved any kind of Savikalpa Samadhi or Nevikalpa Samadhi. Nothing as profound as that. I was just able to kind of like, experience a certain degree of stillness and calm. But my meditations were kind of uninspiring. But nevertheless, I was very interested in this idea of ascended mastery and being able to achieve high states of consciousness through meditation and so forth. And then, of course, I began my career as a peace and conflict resolution researcher, going through university, getting all the degrees, and then getting jobs at different universities. And my journey eventually took me to this field of exopolitics. And through exopolitics, I found out all about supersoldiers. At a certain period, this came up as part of the literature. So for me, it's been quite an interesting journey. And I don't think this is unique just for me. I think many of us have gone through similar journeys trying to understand what it is that we can achieve personally in terms of, whether it's prayer, meditation, or whether it's achieving some kind of peak physical performance, whether it's a sport of some kind, or, for those that are in any kind of martial arts, it's the martial arts. But I think anything physical, the principle is the same. To achieve those states of excellence where you stand above others in a way that gets noticed. So we can think of people who excel in whatever sport as a kind of that's analogous to a super soldier. So clearly, today, there are people and organizations that are very interested in how they can bring about kind of peak performance in soldiers, military personnel. As there are those that are very interested in trying to bring about a kind of peak performance in meditation states, or to achieve these elevated states of consciousness. Now, not surprisingly, this is not unique to us. We are by no means the first to do this. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through a little bit of the history, and the history about this topic of super soldiers and ascended masters. That can go all the way back to the Sumerians. So we can go back 6,000 years in history, and we will find a very similar phenomenon back then. And it involved the gods, if you like. Now, how we know that? We know it because the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, the Eridu Genesis, these are important texts of history according to the Sumerians and the Akkadians, which are the longest known or the earliest civilizations that contemporary historians have identified. Now, certainly we know that there's civilizations older than that, but these are the ones where there are historical records and abundant historical records in the form of cuneiform texts or cuneiform texts. And so these texts, they tell us about these beginnings of humanity and when the gods, or what they call the Anunnaki, created humans, that humanity were a creation of the Anunnaki, of the gods. And it describes the different gods that were involved in that. So in the Enuma Elish, it clearly identifies Enki as being responsible for the creation of man, of humanity. Now, Enki, the term Enki just means earth commander. Ki is the Sumerian for earth, and En is like the commander. So his real name is Ea, Prince Ea. So he's a royal in the royal house of the Anunnaki, and he was made responsible by the assembly of the Anunnaki. So you can read about this in the Enuma Elish. So this is historical records going back 6,000 years. It talks about this assembly of the Anunnaki saying that we want to create humans to replace the Igigi, or the Igigi, who were the Anunnaki working class that rebelled against Enlil, or Yu, who was the space commander for the Anunnaki. That the Anunnaki, they had fears of responsibility. Enlil was in charge of the space fleets, whereas Enki was in charge of Earth, running the Earth and making sure everything on the Earth ran in accordance with the Anunnaki plans. So he was responsible for creating humanity and coming up with the right genetics so that humans would perform optimally as workers for the gold mines and whatever other purposes the Anunnaki had. And Enlil was very clear that he wanted workers to replace the Igigi, and that was what the assembly agreed to. So as the lead Anunnaki geneticist, Prince Ea created the original Adamic DNA along with variations used for avatar bodies designed by the Anunnaki leaders for different purposes. So this is where it's very important to understand that it wasn't just one physical prototype, that the Anunnaki and Enki just created one physical form, the atom, like a dappa, and that was it. What in fact happened was that Enki created quite a number of bodies that would be used by the Anunnaki for different purposes. You would have some that would become workers, that would be intelligent enough to follow orders and just perform the chores that were assigned to them by Enki or Enlil. Others would perform other tasks that were assigned to them. Now, Enki was assisted by his sister or mother, depending on which text you consult, Ninhursag, in the genetic creation of these avatar bodies, or the different bodies that would host souls for performing these functions. Now, one of the things that was also important for the Anunnaki was to create avatar bodies for the Anunnaki themselves to transfer their soul consciousness. So it wasn't just a question of Enlil or Enki or any of their children just coming to Earth and living amongst humanity and giving orders and so forth, because the atmosphere of Earth and the gravity and the resonance field, Schumann resonance and all that, was largely incompatible with the Anunnaki body, which is much more frail. It's tall and thin and kind of frail. So what was created were different avatar bodies, different sizes. And so this is where you get the whole issue of giants. Because I think if you look back at human history, there were many giants. And I think some of these giants were created by the Anunnaki as host bodies for Anunnaki consciousness or souls to transfer themselves into, and they would then walk amongst humans as the leaders. So that way, the Anunnaki, whether it's Enlil, Enki, or someone else, Ninurta, they could safely be on their ships, on their spacecraft, go into a stasis chamber, kind of like in the movie Avatar, go into a stasis chamber, transfer their consciousness into a clone body or into a avatar body on Earth, performing them whatever duties they wanted to perform, and they had a fully functional body, and they could enjoy themselves, they could reproduce, and they could engage with humanity in whatever way they chose to. So there you have historical records showing some of these giants, ranging from the typical human down here, 6 foot, the 6 foot human. Whoa, here we go, the 6 foot human down there, and you go up and you, like that's a 15 foot, and then you just get larger and larger bodies up until 36 feet. And of course, I've seen some that show that some of these giants are supposedly 50 feet. So, there are skeletons that have been found and reported on. Of course, that's been covered up. But we know that the Anunnaki, when they interacted with humans, they were physically giants. And that's represented in some of the glyphs you can find in the Sumerian records. Here, for example, you can see a glyph that shows humans there on the right, and the humans, and then you have the Anunnaki here, clearly much taller. We're probably talking 10, 12 feet, interacting with the humans. So the Anunnaki created giants, one purpose being workers that would mine the gold and whatever other precious metals the Anunnaki needed for their space fleets. Another purpose was avatar bodies for the Anunnaki who would want to come to Earth and kind of like interact with humanity. But clearly for them, it would have been advantageous to be in a giant body relative to the Earthlings, so that way they would command authority and respect. So clearly we understand why they would have done that. And also soldiers. The first super soldiers were these genetically modified giants. The Anunnaki, we know that they had many wars amongst themselves, and they used humans as proxies, and they had giants fighting on both sides. So the Anunnaki, they manufactured some of these giants to be soldiers. So these were genetically modified. Of course, that's the most famous kind of example we know in contemporary history of David and Goliath. And clearly, you have these giants that are genetically created to be soldiers, and they excelled in that art. And so we have evidence for this in the book of Enoch. And in the book of Enoch, chapter 9, what it says is, quote, "And they, the watchers, have gone to the daughters of men upon the earth and have slept with the women, and have defiled themselves and revealed to them all kinds of sins. And the women have borne giants." So, as I said, the Anunnaki that were in these human avatar bodies that were giants, they could interact and breed with humans. And the earth has thereby been filled with blood and unrighteousness. So there it's alluding to the warfare that the giants excelled in. So the giants, one of the purposes for the creation of these giants was to create these super soldiers that would excel in war. And there's evidence, more evidence for this. This was one of the hypnotherapy sessions that Dolores Cannon conducted with one of her clients, and he spoke about a past life when he was a giant, but there were others that were even bigger than him. So again, different sized giants. So he described this other race of giants that actually had advanced technologies and were warriors, and that they would come and kind of rape, pillage, and create mayhem amongst the ordinary human population, and how he would try to fight against those warrior giants. So let's listen to that particular clip.
Chapter 4: Different Life Forms. Land of the Giants. Jack saw himself as a very tall man named Lars with long blonde hair. His head came to half the height of the tree he was standing by. He was dressed in brown canvas pants and a shirt with puffy sleeves, with leather straps over his shoulders to hold the pants. He was wearing sandals with soles made of bark and a sheath with a sword on his back. The sword was used for protection against the people that were even larger than him. He could smell bread baking from a small cottage in the distance. There are little people that live there. They can't fend for themselves. He was bringing them a deer that he was holding in his hand, and flour. There's a young woman, and I see 2 small girls and a baby. I am so much larger than them, but I feel a love towards these small people. To illustrate how much bigger he was, he said the woman's head came only to his waist. There were villages of these small people, and they were in danger from beings who were larger than him. He felt an obligation to protect them. He did not live in their villages, but on the nearby mountain. I can see and overlook everything. I can overlook the valley and see if there's anything that goes wrong. He was only doing it because of a love for these small people. It was cold in this area, and people often wore fur. He lived in a structure made of rocks with his family, parents, brothers, sisters, who he also took care of. The larger people lived on an island off the coast of the big water. They came in the spring and fall in their big iron boats. These bigger people lived in darkness in large castles made of huge stones with big log doors. They were never satisfied and wanted what everyone else had. They killed everything just to kill. They had mechanical things, guns that shot fire. Their ships looked like they flew as they came across the water with no sails. He described them as having a face like a bulldog, lower extruding jaw with 2 teeth over the upper lip, a big hump on the back and very little hair. They walked slumped over. He knew what they looked like because he had wounded some of them in a battle and once in the water. He insisted he did not kill, but defended himself.
Okay, so there you have this past life memory of one giant protecting humans against even larger giants who had modern or more modern weapons, metals that they used for warfare. So there was a warrior caste of giants, and so the giants, we can see that some of the giants were specifically bred for being a warrior caste or super soldiers. Now, there are other examples, historical examples, talking about super soldiers. And probably one of the clearest is in Vedic India, where they talk about this great war. The Mahabharata is a text that talks about this great war that occurred in India roughly 4,000, 5,000 years ago, somewhere in that time frame. And here you have 2 opposing warriors from both sides, both of whom were bred from the sun god. So both of them had genetics that were related to the sun god, and that suggests that they were these genetically modified super soldiers. Karna and Arjuna, from the opposing factions, the Mahabharata highlights the personal battle between them in the midst of this great regional war that engulfed all of northern India at this time. And these are other examples of super soldiers, because they are described as wielding these incredible weapons, that they have these above normal or extraordinary powers that they use for warfare. And because we know that they were genetically bred, because of that sun god connection, they have these extraordinary martial abilities, and they were natural warriors. These are examples of super soldiers in Vedic India. Now, what's very interesting is that the current Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, he interprets the Mahabharata text as actually being literally a description of these super soldiers fighting against one another. So in a story that was published in the Guardian in October 2014, Narendra Modi said that when you look at the ancient Indian texts, that genetic experiments occurred thousands of years ago in Vedic India. And he's not alone in suggesting that. And this is what he said that I thought was pretty significant for the topic today. What he said was, this is quoted in the story, quote, "We can feel proud of what our country achieved in medical science at one point of time. We all read about Karna in the Mahabharata. If we think a little more, we realize that the Mahabharata says Karna was not born from his mother's womb. This means that genetic science was present at that time. This is why Karna could be born outside of his mother's womb." So what Narendra Modi is very clearly suggesting here is that Karna was a byproduct of a genetic experiment, that he was a genetically created super soldier. So that, I think, is very interesting, because what it tells us is that this issue that we face today, in terms of the diverging pathways that lie before us, both individually and collectively as a planet, in terms of, do we go down the path of becoming a pool for super soldiers, or a pool for kind of like ascended mastery? This was the same pathways that the ancients had to deal with, had to make choices about. So this brings us to the modern era. And in the modern era, I believe, looking at all of the literature, there are 4 types of super soldiers that are described in the literature in terms of programs, classified programs, trying to create peak human performance in soldiers using a variety of techniques. So I'm going to go through each of these different types of super soldiers, and we're going to get a good idea exactly how super soldiers are optimized humans in some way, who have been optimized through various mechanisms. So one of the mechanisms is the MK Ultra, the famous MK Ultra experiments that I'm sure many of you have heard about. So MK Ultra, these were experiments that were run by the CIA. One of the chief scientists involved with that was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who adopted techniques from Nazi scientists who arrived in the United States through Operation Paperclip. So the Nazis themselves had begun the very first MK Ultra mind control experiments, and they brought with them to the United States their programs, their knowledge of how to optimize human performance in soldiers. And so they came up with this MK Ultra mind control. And so that was something that was developed by the CIA and some of the intelligence community. Now, we know that this happened because of the Church Senate committee hearings that happened in 1977. So they exposed the mind control experiments that were trauma-based. So there were a variety of ways in which this MK Ultra operated, but one of the key ways of doing it was to induce trauma in the subjects, and somehow that trauma would then lead to the splitting of the mind, where one part of the mind, a compartment of the mind, could be programmed to be anything they want. So, it could be programmed to be an assassin. So, that's like, there was a movie in the that came out, I think it was 1964, starring Frank Sinatra, called Manchurian Candidate. That was actually an expose of this MK Ultra program. So the Manchurian Candidate, when you had that splitting of the mind through these MK Ultra techniques, that person could be programmed to be an assassin, or could be programmed to be a soldier that performs at an exemplary level, at a level way beyond normal human performance. So that's MK Ultra. That's not the only mind control mechanism. There's another type of mind control mechanism that was used, and this was actually called the Jedi Project. So this uses neuro-linguistic programming. It was conducted by the US Army, and there was a story in the Washington Post that appeared that was around 1983, I think it was. Let's try and see the date there. 1988, that story came out. So the Pentagon's Twilight Zone. So, quote, this is what it said. In 1984, the US military launched a 5-month experiment called Project Jedi, named after the Star Wars knights who were able to use the Force to perform unusual feats, including using a weapon blindfolded. It tested the use of neuro-linguistic programming as a specific discipline developed to model human excellence. So this is not that trauma-based mind control used in MK Ultra, but it's using one of the elements of that, which is this neuro-linguistic programming, which is kind of like programming people by repeating phrases and kind of inducing a certain state of consciousness by using words in a particular way. So that doesn't need to be necessarily traumatic. It's just repetition, repetition, repetition. People learn to believe that they're a super soldier that can do whatever. So the Jedi Project actually was a real project run by the Army that started in 1984. Now, presumably, it only ran for 5 months and then it disappeared. Typically, what happens in these kinds of programs is they run a feasibility study using open source scientists to kind of like find out how feasible something like this is. And when they find out that it is feasible, then it goes classified. But as far as the public is concerned, program is cancelled, nothing to see here, move along. So, but it continued secretly. So the project, the Jedi Project, using neuro-linguistic program, you can take it to the bank that continued in some way. That the Army, and I'm sure other military services, use these kinds of neuro-linguistic programs to create super soldiers.